Hello, everyone. Glad to be back here again with our guest, Mihret. So, Mihret, um, welcome. And I would like to start by inviting you to tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mihret. I am a social worker here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Um, I've been, um, I'm originally from Ethiopia, but I've been living in Canada most of my life. Majority of my age numbers, I have been here. Um, but I was born and raised in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia up until the age of 9. Um, and now I'm here.
Wonderful. In Africa, when we talk about Ethiopia, um, it's usually the case that we would always talk about Ethiopia as one of, is it one or the only, strictly speaking, African country that was not colonized? What does it
Mhm.
mean to live or be born in an African country that was not colonized? I don't have that experience. I grew up in Nigeria, and you know that Nigeria was colonized by Great Britain. Uh,
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about Ethiopia and what it means growing up there, and what was it about Ethiopia that just the colonizers couldn't get through?
Um, to be honest, I don't know if I can answer that because
Okay,
I I I don't know much about, you know, that historical aspect.
right.
There is a first part of your question that I feel like I can answer, which was what was it like growing up in Ethiopia?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, when I compare it to some of my other friends that grew up in other parts of Africa that have that colonial history, that more in-depth colonial um experience, right?
Yeah.
Um, we do we do have in Ethiopia, we do have a little bit of Italian influence because the Italians did come and they did stay for a few years. So there is a bit of just a bit of that influence. Um, so but and I find that it's not as much as some of the other countries, where especially culturally, it's just it almost feels very, when we talk about the idea of globalization, right? The idea of like right now, especially with technology, with movies, media, and things like that, it feels like everywhere you go, you see America, right? So it doesn't matter where you are, you could see American culture. With Ethiopia growing up, I don't know if it's like that anymore, but when I was younger growing up, it didn't feel like that. It felt when you were in Ethiopia, what you experienced, what you felt was Ethiopian culture.
Mm,
Um, like um the under like speaking English, understanding English was not something that was a given for anybody. That was something that came usually most of the time if an Ethiopian person living in Ethiopia um spoke English and was able to understand it, it was a result of either they probably spent time outside of the country or they went and got extra education for it and invested in it. It's not something that's was very, at least when I was younger, was very common in the culture. So things like that, things that was very just when you were in Ethiopia, you felt like you were in Ethiopia, you knew you were in Ethiopia, and everything you saw was Ethiopia. You didn't see many other cultures
mm,
um,
mm.
very much. So I think that was something that
Yeah,
was a bit different.
right,
Yeah.
right. And no, I mean, I could contrast that definitely growing up in Nigeria, even though I was familiar with my culture, my language, I could still feel the influence of Hollywood, for example, of even Bollywood, for that matter, as well as other forms of soft power, soft Western power, in terms of clothing, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the educational system and all. So you grew up speaking what language?
So I grew up speaking Amharic. Yeah,
Amharic.
yeah, Amharic, which is Amharic. That would,
Great.
yeah,
And is this something you can still speak today?
of course, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wonderful. So you moved from Ethiopia, which, strictly speaking, was not colonized as other countries. You mentioned that the Italians at some point settled there, and especially so during, I think, prior is it to the Second World War with Mussolini. But still, Ethiopians were able to resist the occupation, which did not last for long. And you moved to Canada, which is another interesting, environment in terms of colonization.
Hmm.
It's one that the colonizer stayed back, right? So if you grew up in Ethiopia without any form of external
Hmm.
influence or influences, I don't think you've been able to escape that in Canada. What would you say has been some sort of the difference living in Ethiopia and now as a Canadian?
Um, I mean, there's a lot of differences. I think the biggest one I feel is the culturally. I think Canada is very individualistic in our system, and I think that's the biggest one that I feel. Whereas Ethiopian culture is extremely collective. It's extremely collective. We live together. We did that, there's not really one life, it's all our lives, and in Canada, it's not really like that in our systems. It's not like that. So I would say that's the biggest difference that I notice. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
Besides the cold.
Beside the cold, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see the snow actually falling outside. We can't do anything about that. Though people will say this year has actually been quite warmer than other winters, right? Thanks to climate change. Yeah, okay. This is a more individualistic, and Ethiopia is more communal, collectivistic. In what ways, though, do you, and maybe this might help, people who are moving from other cultures, whether collective or individualistic, into a different one. How would you say you have tried, to maintain the balance? Because you said to me that you still speak the language. How
Mhm.
has that been possible?
I think I still speak the language because to credit my brother growing up, he made sure that I read my Bible, and I always read it in my language, which is Amharic. So I think that is what has um mainly helped me. Growing up, I attended an Ethiopian church, although we had an English Sunday school because a lot of the kids were born and raised here, even though they had Ethiopian parents. And then just being surrounded by family and the community, hearing it all the time at home, speaking on the phone, things like that. I think I just watching movies, I just never, it was always around me. So I think I was able to hold on to the language. Um, yeah. And in terms of, go ahead.
No, 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 I was just saying, so it entails some sort of an intentional effort on your part.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
Great. And maybe a follow-up question. So for me, like you were talking about the difference living in Ethiopia and Canada. For me, one of the things that I noticed was when I was in Nigeria, I was an Angan, person, or I was from the north of Nigeria. Yeah, some people would make allusion to, my dark skin hue, but coming to Canada, I became a black man, right?
Mm,
And it's something that, people to, take for granted. Like,
mhm,
so you as a black man, could you tell us this, that? And sometimes I go like, but it's not the identity. It's not something I identify with.
mm,
Yes, I appreciate the history in North America and also in Europe, but there is much more to me than just being called a black man. And I would always think that is gonna. I would be remiss if I didn't tell people, my background and other identity affiliations, that mean a lot to me. Was that in any way, has that been your experience in any way? Like, did you realize you were Amharic, or I don't know the name of your group, and then
Yeah.
moving to Canada, you also became Black?
Honestly, I personally, I don't think I did personally, but I know other Ethiopians did. Like I know, for example, like my second mom here, she always tells me the experience of like when she didn't know she was Black until she got here because she's always identified. Like in Ethiopia, there's you're Ethiopian and there's other Ethiopians. And again, that's like speaking to earlier when I was talking about like growing up in Ethiopia because of the minimal colonial experiences we've had, it feels very secluded. It's very within itself, right? Where you're not even aware of like what's going on outside of that country unless you're making intentional efforts, right? Because it's not really in the culture, it's not really, it's just very homogenous, I guess this would be the correct word, right? Ethiopia in itself is not homogenous, I will say that, but within the country itself. And so because of that, my second mom here, she always says that like she just never even thought of herself because it's just you know yourself and then you look everywhere and then you see yourself, you know? So the question answers itself. Um, but coming here, the way that people reacted towards her, her hair, her afro, she said she had an afro, and then people labeled her as Black, and that's when she understood, oh, I'm a Black person, I'm Black. She didn't even know because that's not how she saw herself as Ethiopian, she saw herself as Habesha, right? So for me personally, to be honest, I don't know if I ever had that experience growing up when I first came. Um, there was some diversity when I came. Um, in my school, like in my elementary school, there were kids that were Asian and things like that. And so I don't know, like, often I was the only of my own kind. Like, oftentimes I was the only Black person. Um, but um, I never really felt that. Um, and then when I'm trying to think I lost. And I think
No,
part
yeah,
of that
no, I have a
also,
question for you actually, because you just said oftentimes you are maybe the only Black person around. So would you then say that you are a Black person? Is that something you would
yeah,
identify?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure I'm
And
Black.
what would that mean? How would you translate that um, in terms of its expressions?
Yeah, I think identities are just so weird. I think for me, it just means that my ancestry is is from Africa, and also that like I'm you look, I think it's also how other people identify you, right? People probably look at me and identify me as Black, right? And so I think it's also how we identify ourselves. I think there's two parts, right? The first part is we identify ourselves and how we know ourselves to be, number one. And then number two, we identify ourselves on how other people experience that.
So would you
So
say then your identity as a Black person is how you identify yourself or how other people identify you that you've come to accept?
I think it's a bit of both. Yeah. Yeah.
In Ethiopia, were you Black?
Yeah. For me, and maybe that's why I never had, maybe that's why I never had that that experience
Hmm.
because prior coming to Canada is I also lived in Kenya and I also didn't have any I also didn't have an identity thing. I just like and I went to school in Kenya with other Kenyans and like to the like the Kenyan public school or whatever it was and I never felt like I never really had that experience. And
Hmm.
so maybe it's just that I've always just just been me. So I just never had that really that big identity experience. I think for me, the part that when I started having it was um when I went into university
Mhm.
and I started learning about colonization. I started learning about specifically well, I started becoming more aware of like the history in the United States,
Hmm.
uh, colonization, uh, all of that things, colonization here in Canada. And that's when I started to really think about my identity and its impact and my responsibility. And that's when it really like I started experiencing it. And so I would say for myself, my realization of identity is a result of intellectualism as opposed to like a natural
Mm.
um experience, which my second mom had.
Okay, so maybe let's touch on the intellectual aspects. So given all this history you mentioned of slave trade, settler colonialism in North America, US, Canada in particular. One of the ways in which they have been trying to deal with it or this history is through acknowledging at least one month in the year to give to Black people to celebrate Blackness, and we happen to be in that month, right? February is the month for Blackness, whatever that means. Um, what is your relationship with the with the Black History Month, and generally Blackness at the intellectual level?
Hmm. I mean, like identity is such a big thing, and I don't think it's fair um to box people into one identity because
Mm,
people have people have different experiences, different people groups have different history. So if you come to my country of origin, Ethiopia, we have over 80 different ethnic groups.
mhm,
And each one of them have their own way of identifying themselves,
mhm,
their own emotion, their own feelings that go up with those identities, their own values and their own history. So you can't take the history, the identity, and the emotion of one identity group and then generalize it to everybody just because they all happen to be in that geography with Ethiopian and they all happen to be there or they all happen to be Black. That's not fair. That I don't think that's yeah, I don't know if that's a fair thing to do. So, but there is um also something that we experience as a huge diverse group of people. We experience this one common thing globally, which is anti-Blackness,
mm,
unfortunately. And that's something that has, I guess, made us kind of unite, right?
mm,
Despite our diversity. Um, and so I think things like Black History Month, February, Black Lives Matter, the movements that we're seeing, the movements that have been happening for decades and decades, and the resistance that has been happening globally all over the place
mm,
now um, is a response to that. As a
mm,
response, I don't think it's as a result of lack of diversity within the community, but I think it's a response to a generalized anti-Blackness that we experience.
mm. And you mentioned the Black Lives Matter. We know it's been in existence for quite a bit, I think since 2013, and it became a global phenomenon after George Floyd. Uh,
Mhm,
um, the Black American man killed by the police in the
mhm,
United States, and we've continued to see this act of violence, intentional violence towards the Black body, right?
mhm.
So there is this physical violence. How do you think this has really impacted the Black community in North America?
Um, I mean, I think it's been I mean, an awakening, right? And I think we get those every few years, right? We get that awakening of the reality that we're living in, right? That we're still experiencing, um, some of us, colonialism, some of us the ramification of it, and some of it like the what do you call it? What a oh my God, my vocabulary is just terrible. Um, Whatever, I guess I'll just leave it at that. And some of us just anti-Blackness.
mm,
And I think when big incidents, or not even necessarily big incidents, because these could be incidents that happen on a daily basis, but when incidents um, like what happened with George Floyd take the attention of the media and they go viral, it's a reminder and awakening
mm,
for the community of the reality
mm,
of what life is like
mm,
in a lot of spaces as a Black person. Um, and
mm,
I think when you asked me about that identity question, and I mentioned that second part about it's the way the world sees us, is because when you're a Black person, I don't think every day you wake up and you're like, I'm a Black person, I'm a Black person, I'm a Black person, you know? And it's not fair to put that on Black people. I think let's say you're a Black man and you wake up and you're thinking about going to work, and you're thinking about your family, you're thinking about your goals, you're thinking about your ambitions, this. And then it's the moments of anti-Blackness that take us outside of our humanity.
yeah. And Ian Williams would call that, Ian Williams, I think, is a literature professor at the University of Toronto. He calls that moments of disorientation, right?
Yeah.
That, you don't wake up, yes, thinking you are this, you are that. But again, you move around and people remind you of
Hmm. Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they ask of your identity, or something happens to make you, feel a certain way. And so he calls that, those disorienting moments that
Mhm.
actually minorities often feel in dominant or contexts with dominator
Mhm.
cultures. Is it a coincidence? Maybe we can end on a lighter note. Is it a coincidence that Black History Month also falls in the month of the so-called month of love?
Um, I yeah, I think it's a coincidence, but maybe it's nice to think it's not, you know? Um, it's nice. Um, yeah, maybe we're a people of love.
Could you say more about that, love?
Uh, um, I don't know in what sense.
In any sense?
Um, yeah, I think love is a big thing. I think that in our culture we are seeing um an increasingly hyper focus
Mm,
on romantic love,
mm,
uh, which is fine and it's lovely and everything, but I think it's important to also appreciate and honor and make room for non-romantic love,
mm,
because these are just as important. And we focus so much on preparing for a romantic love and being in our romantic love, whatever, that sometimes we can neglect um, other forms of love in our lives. And
mm,
so that's I and speaking of love and my current season, that's what I'm thinking about, is that how do because I think love is a gift. It's a gift from God, right?
mm,
And so how do I appreciate all these other forms of love gift that God has given me in my life, and how do I honor it properly, and how do I show up for it in a
mm.
good way? Um,
I'm
yeah.
tempted to ask though what these other forms of love beside the romantic love are.
Um, Again, that's agape love, the love that we have with our creator, our friendship, our family,
Mm,
um, our work, our jobs, like those are all, things that um we may love or show us love in a different way, right? And so how do we relate to that in a good way?
And so when we talk about, you talk about the anti-Blackness, colonialism, all these forms of violence, not just Black people, but generally people around the world. especially if we look at, the context we're living in today. A lot of people are suffering. Would you say they are suffering because we haven't internalized this different forms of love? And if we could only do that, then we can begin to see, less and less suffering, not just in the Black community, but, generally in other hotspots of violence.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's ultimately for me, I think it's a disconnect
Mm,
from our creator, right? From our purpose
mm,
that causes chaos, right? And that causes pain and things like that. So I think if we and I want to preface, like, we can't control um how other people react or what other people do, and what are whether how other people choose to show up in the world, you know. um you can be a perfectly fine person and still be a victim of violence.
mm.
And so I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying if you just work on yourself, you might not be a victim.
Yeah.
Because that's not right. But I do want to say that I think if all of us
Mm,
uh where did this work, then maybe slowly but surely uh we might be closer to a
mm,
more loving, a more safe uh home
mm,
here
mm.
on
Yeah.
this spinning rock.
Yeah, I mean, so the point is that we can't necessarily eliminate pain and suffering just by loving, but we can be able to live through, suffering and pain
Mhm.
by loving. I think it seems like is the point you are making, and
Mhm.
hopefully creates some sort of a home, whether home at home or home away from home for those who have left home, whatever really that means. Mihret, it's been fantastic talking to you, about your childhood in Ethiopia, moving to Canada, being a social worker here, and your experience also as a Black person. We appreciate your time, and we wish you well in all your endeavors. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the month of love. May the love you give be also the love you receive. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben. Bye.